At the restaurant, under chandeliers warm enough to lie about the moment, my brother lifted his glass and said clear as a bell, "An adopted girl like you doesn't belong here." No whisper, no hesitation, just a clean public cut. The table erupted laughter sharp enough to scrape bone. My parents didn't blink. The server slid a $2,500 check in front of me like it had my name etched into the leather. I didn't argue, didn't flinch. I just smiled the kind you wear when you've run out of places to stand. And then a single word sliced through the noise. Wait. My grandfather ended every laugh in the room with just that one breath. I was 5 when the world split open, metal on metal glass scattering across asphalt, voices, fading into a kind of ringing that never really left me. Florida's Child Services called it an urgent placement. I called it moving from one temporary living room to the next, each door closing before I could memorize the wallpaper. When Linda and Mark Ellis signed the papers, everyone said I was lucky. A family at last, stability, a home. I was too young to understand that some homes come with price tags and some signatures mean ownership, not belonging. The day I arrived in Coral Gables, Ryan stood in the hallway, arms folded, studying the small bag of clothes I carried. "That's it," he asked, nudging it with his shoe. "Can she trade for better stuff?" Linda laughed like it was harmless. "We'll see what we can do." But she only came back with shirts Ryan had outgrown and a pair of shoes with worn soles. "Use these until we figure things out," she said, already walking away. "Use until became the rhythm of my childhood." Chloe barely looked up from her tablet. "Mom said adopted kids are like loans," she told Ryan as if I wasn't 3 feet away. He nodded, satisfied with the explanation. Their rooms were covered in new posters, new bedding, new gadgets. Mine had a single dresser that smelled faintly of someone else's perfume, and a mattress softer in the middle where another child had slept before me. In grade school, I learned to measure my value by absence. Field trips Ryan took were too expensive for all 3 kids. Chloe got custom outfits for recitals. I got a plastic bin of hand-me-down options that came from neighbors, not family. My straight-A report cards were pinned to the side of the fridge, the part facing the wall, while Ryan's soccer trophies occupied an entire shelf of their own. At family dinners, I was always placed 1 seat from the end, close enough to serve dishes down the table, far enough that I could be edited out of photos without anyone noticing. Linda called it an old habit, the way she naturally angled the camera toward her biological kids. "Smile a little less," she told me once. "It throws off the composition." By middle school, Ryan had developed a routine. At gatherings, he'd raise his glass water, soda, anything, and say, "To the real Ellis kids." Chloe would snicker. Adults would pretend they didn't hear. I learned to keep my eyes on my plate and wait for the moment to pass. College widened the gap. Ryan toured private universities with a counselor. Chloe got editorial help on every application. When I printed out my acceptance letters, Linda flipped through them like bills she didn't want to pay. "A 2-year program is more realistic," she said. "We can't afford more. You understand?" But we never included me. I worked late shifts, shelving merchandise, paid my own tuition, and walked across the graduation stage with no Ellis in the audience. The seat they never planned to fill stayed empty. Still, I stayed quiet. Still, I tried. I brought home freelance work, built a career from borrowed laptops and public Wi-Fi. Every win I shared dissolved into a comparison to Ryan's progress or Chloe's following. My successes registered as background noise, a hum they could talk over. Looking back, I can see the pattern clearly, how every door closed just gently enough to seem accidental. But the night at the restaurant, when the laughter rose over my brother's words, I felt the old pattern shift. For the first time, it didn't sink. It cracked. It happened a few weeks before the dinner, quietly, almost politely, the way erasure usually works. I was in the living room holding a printout of my newest contract, a number I'd worked years to earn. $50,000. More than any of them knew I was capable of. "Good for you," Linda said, already turning toward Chloe, who was adjusting the lighting for another sponsored post. "Honey, angle your chin. That's it. Beautiful." My news slipped out of the room like steam. No one noticed it leave. Later that night, I walked past the hallway they called the family gallery frames, arranged perfectly spanning birthdays, recitals, graduations. Ryan in his cap and gown, Chloe cutting a ribbon at her dance recital, Mark and Linda holding them candles glowing behind. I scanned for myself even though I knew better. Not a single photograph. 22 years and I wasn't in one captured moment. At dinner the next Sunday, the imbalance sharpened. I tried again, light tone, small smile, mentioning a potential long-term client. Mark nodded, then asked Ryan about his workout routine. When I opened my mouth again, Chloe lifted her phone and angled it to crop me out of the frame. A practiced motion, almost graceful. It wasn't the first exclusion, just the first one that didn't sting. Numbness has a different temperature, quieter, heavier. I sat there feeling the space around me shrink until I was an outline no one bothered to fill. So at the restaurant, when Ryan said what he said, the part that surprised me wasn't the insult. It was how familiar it felt, like a phrase I'd been rehearsing without ever speaking. That's why I smiled. Not from strength, from recognition. I drove home from the restaurant without turning on the radio. The night outside Miami was warm, but the silence inside the car stayed cold, steady, almost deliberate. By the time I reached my building, the humiliation had settled into something flatter. Not rage, not grief, just clarity, thin and sharp enough to cut without bleeding. I didn't turn on the lights when I stepped inside. The dark made it easier to breathe. I set my bag down, slipped off my shoes, and walked straight to the small desk pressed against the window. The city glowed outside each light, a reminder that life moved even when families didn't. I opened my laptop. No dramatic gesture, no angry typing, just a steady sequence of clicks. Inbox, archive, old folders, files labeled things like statements, payments, records. Documents I used to skim, believing whatever the Ellis family told me about household expenses. I'd saved them mostly out of habit scanning and storing each envelope they redirected to me. For years, I thought I was being responsible. That night, I realized I'd been collecting evidence. I pulled the first stack onto the desk. Withdrawals, transfers, amounts that didn't match the stories I'd been told. I created a spreadsheet color-coded by decade, a line for every year since I'd arrived at the Ellis home, a column for who benefited, another for what was taken. Each row filled itself slowly: tuition for Ryan's private school, Chloe's extracurricular programs, renovations on the Coral Gables house. The trust my biological parents left behind had been treated like a fountain that existed to water the Ellis garden. I didn't react, didn't tense. My fingers moved across the keys as if they already knew where this was going. Somewhere between the 50th and 60th line, the coldness settled deeper, a kind of calm that felt nothing like defeat, more like arrival. Around midnight, I printed the documents. The cheap home printer coughed out each page with a mechanical whine, the kind that echoed in rooms where people lived alone. I laid the sheets on the table one by one, lining them in chronological order until the past 2 decades stretched across the wood like a timeline of borrowed futures. At the very end of the row, I placed the last object I had from my early childhood, a small photo of me at 6 years old, standing outside a foster home whose name I barely remembered. My hands hung stiff at my sides. My face looked uncertain, as if waiting to see if someone would call me back inside. I set the picture down, not to mourn it, but to mark the beginning of the pattern. A soft knock pulled me from the table. 3 slow taps. Harold. He didn't wait for me to open the door fully. He stepped inside, glanced at the papers, and exhaled the kind of breath people release when a truth they've carried alone is finally shared. I knew, he said. His voice wasn't apologetic, just honest. I didn't have the proof, but I knew. I didn't say anything. Silence had always been my safest language. He walked to the table, adjusting his glasses, studying the pattern with a businessman's precision. They used every dollar he asked. Almost, I said. Not on me. He nodded slowly, as if confirming the answer to a question he had asked himself for years. We are not fighting them, he said. We're correcting the record. He didn't ask if I was ready. He simply sat across from me and began outlining what would become our plan, turning each document into part of a case file, each gap into a lead. He listed the professionals we would need: a forensic accountant, a trust officer, a legal advisor, people who dealt in systems, not emotions. While he talked, I gathered the papers into neat piles and placed them into labeled envelopes, year by year, loss by loss, fact by fact. When he finally paused, the room felt different, less like the home of someone overlooked and more like the war room of someone preparing to reclaim what had always been hers. Harold glanced at the doorway at the darkness behind me. "You don't owe them anger," he said. "Just truth." I nodded again. After he left, I continued the rest alone. I opened the family group chat, scrolled through years of messages where my words floated unanswered. Birthday invitations I'd been forgotten on, pictures I'd been cropped out of. Then I tapped Leave Group. No announcement, no explanation. Next, I searched for the list of auto payments tied to my account subscriptions, utilities contributions Linda had directed me to handle for the household even after I'd moved out. I deleted each one. Click, click, click. Each cancellation sent a quiet pulse of finality through the apartment. By dawn, the apartment was still dark, but the weight in the room had shifted. I glanced once more at the timeline on the table, the story they'd written with my inheritance, and then gathered everything into a single binder. Every page slid into place with a soft, decisive sound. Before closing it, I added the photo from my childhood to the front pocket. Not as a reminder of loss, but as the first page of evidence. A new day seeped into the room, pale against the blinds. I stood there, binder in hand, and realized I felt no urge to justify myself anymore. That part of me had already been emptied at the restaurant, somewhere between the laughter and the check they expected me to sign. This was different. This was direction. This was control. I set the binder by the door, ready for the next meeting with Harold, and walked into the kitchen. The air was cool, thin, steady. This time I whispered not to the room, but to the version of me who'd taken every slight and swallowed it whole. "I won't fix what they've broken." 2 days later, we met them again. Same restaurant, same chandeliers, same heavy hum of weekend chatter. Ryan had chosen the place to celebrate a small promotion, something loud enough to center himself again. They didn't know Harold was the one who requested my presence. They had no idea what he carried in the leather folder pressed beneath his arm. I arrived last. Ryan smirked when he saw me, like the lingering bruise of his insult still pleased him. Chloe adjusted her phone case, checking angles for a reel she planned to film. Linda and Mark sat straighter, performing warmth they never used on me. The server poured water. Silverware clinked. Nothing about the moment warned them. Harold waited until plates were set down. Then he pushed his chair back slowly, the scrape of wood against tile tightening the air. "Before you order," he said, "we need to address something." Ryan rolled his eyes. "Grandpa, can this wait?" "We're no," Harold said. "It cannot." He placed the leather folder on the table. Just the sound of it landing was enough to still a few nearby conversations. Mark's smile thinned. "Dad, what is that?" 22 years, Harold said. Documented. Verified. He opened the folder and slid out a stack of papers. The audit results, trust statements, the timeline I had built. They looked ordinary on the table, harmless even, but the effect was immediate. Linda's fingers trembled before she even touched them. "I spoke with the trust officer this morning," Harold continued. "Every withdrawal traced, every payment accounted for. Not $1 used for the child it was meant to protect." Ryan snorted. "Oh, come on. That trust was practically family money." Harold looked at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Family money does not mean stolen money. Chloe quietly started recording, tilting her phone low. Harold noticed but didn't stop her. Linda tried first. "Dad, she. Raising an extra child costs. It cost Joyce everything," Harold said. "Her education, her future, her place in this family." The table went silent. Then he reached into the folder again, pulling out a single document, thick paper, embossed seal, signatures still fresh. He set it in the center. "This," he said, "is my revised will." Ryan froze mid-breath. Chloe's phone dropped a few inches. Mark's napkin slipped from his hand. Harold tapped the page gently. "My entire estate transfers to Joyce. Effective immediately." The restaurant noise dimmed as if someone had drawn curtains around the table. Ryan leaned forward, color draining fast. "You're joking. You can't just give everything to her. She's not even—" He caught himself, but the word had already formed. Harold didn't flinch. Finish the sentence? Ryan didn't. He sat back, chest rising, fast, jaw tight. Linda reached out, voice thin. Dad, please. Think of the optics. Think of what people will say. I'm thinking of what you did, Harold said, and of what she endured. He placed his phone on the table, pressed a button, and spoke evenly. Call from contacts. Trust office. A crisp voice answered within seconds. Harold didn't look away from them. Confirm the amendment filed this morning, he said. Yes, Mr. Bennett, full transfer to beneficiary Joyce Ellis. Irrevocable. The call ended. The finality stayed. Chloe lowered her phone. For the first time all night, she wasn't performing. Harold turned to me, then quietly, steadily. You don't have to take anything from them ever again. I didn't speak. There was nothing to add. The truth was already louder than any argument. Across the table, their silence no longer felt like power. It felt like consequence. The morning after the will was finalized, Miami felt different, quieter somehow, as if the city had stepped back and let me breathe for the first time. I walked along the edge of the bay, the water rising and folding in slow, patient rhythms. Nothing dramatic, just space. A kind of space I'd never been offered inside the Ellis household. I didn't think about the money, or the headlines, or the stunned silence that followed Harold's announcement. What stayed with me was a softer image, the way he placed his hand over mine when the meeting ended, steady and certain, as if anchoring me to a life I had never been allowed to claim. For days, I kept my routine small. Work in the morning, walks in the afternoon, evenings spent in the penthouse office with Harold as he explained the foundation he wanted me to lead, its goals, its responsibilities, how every part of it was designed to give kids like me what I never had someone who chose them. After his passing, the silence inside his office grew heavier, but not painful, more like a room where the light still remembered the person who stood there. I continued his plans, signing papers he had outlined, shaping programs he'd drafted on yellow notepads. Doing the work felt like continuing a conversation we hadn't finished. Months later, the legal dust around the Ellis family settled. No dramatic confrontations, no demands, only quiet distance. The kind that doesn't sting because it's finally intentional. I kept boundaries clean, firm, kind. When Linda began volunteering at a children's center in Miami, I heard about it through another board member. I didn't visit, but I didn't avoid the thought of her either. People change when they're left alone with the weight of their choices. Sometimes that's enough. Ryan sent a short email after a therapy session. No excuses, just acknowledgement. I replied with one line, "Thank you for saying it. Nothing more was needed." Chloe disappeared from social media for a while, resurfacing later with quieter posts books. She was reading Small Moments with no filters. I didn't engage, but I didn't block her either. At the Foundation's first scholarship ceremony, I stood behind the podium as students filed in with their families. The room buzzed with possibility, not performance. Near the back, Linda arrived with a group of kids from her center. Our eyes met. She gave a small nod. I returned it. That was enough. When the event ended, I stepped outside into the late afternoon heat. The sky was pale gold, soft along the horizon. I let the air settle around me, steady and warm, nothing like the restaurant lights that once made everything feel colder. For the first time, the quiet didn't feel like erasure. It felt like release. I used to think belonging was something earned, a seat you fought, for a place you waited to be invited into. But distance teaches its own kind of truth. Some tables were never meant for me. Some rooms were never meant to hold my name. And that's not a loss, it's clarity. Freedom isn't loud. It arrives in the quiet, in the breath you take, when no one is pulling at you in the life you build without asking permission. If my story stayed with you, share where you're listening from and tell me, have you ever walked away to finally find your place?